The illusion of perfection often hides the most profound struggles. We see curated images, hear carefully constructed narratives, and assume we understand the foundations of other people's lives. But sometimes, behind the polished veneer, a quiet storm brews, one where dignity is tested and the true cost of arrogance is finally paid. Today, we're diving into a story that peels back those layers, a story about a man who built his world on the dismissal of others, and a woman who, in her silence, held a universe he never bothered to explore. Imagine a marriage that, from the outside, appeared flawless. Richard and Emily Coleman, their suburban home, their social circle, their carefully maintained facade of success. It was the kind of union neighbors whispered about, assuming it was destined for eternity. But as we often find, the most immaculate exteriors can conceal the deepest fissures. Within the carefully trimmed hedges of their home, cracks spread like spiderwebs across glass, invisible to the casual observer, yet deeply destructive to those within. Richard, a man who wore confidence as a second skin, allowed that confidence to curdle into something far more toxic: arrogance, hardening into outright cruelty. It's a common psychological trap, isn't it? When success becomes intertwined with a sense of untouchability, when accomplishments feed an ego unchecked by empathy, that's when a person risks losing their humanity. Richard wasn't just confident, he was consumed by a belief in his own superiority, a belief that needed to be constantly reaffirmed, often at Emily's expense. He would remind Emily almost daily of his perceived magnanimity. He told her, with a sneer that twisted his features, how he had saved her from obscurity. Without his last name, without his earnings, she would still be, in his demeaning words, a nobody folding discount sweaters at a department store. This wasn't rooted in truth, not even a shred of it. But Richard believed it with a fervent conviction, and in his self-serving belief, he found an endless wellspring of opportunities to humiliate her, to chip away at her spirit peace by agonizing peace. Have you ever witnessed that kind of dynamic, where one person in a relationship systematically attempts to diminish the other, not through physical violence, but through a constant barrage of verbal and emotional attacks? It's a slow poison, far more insidious than a single explosive argument. It erodes self-worth, plants seeds of doubt, and isolates the victim in a silent prison of their abuser's making. Richard's tactics were a textbook example of emotional abuse and gaslighting. He wasn't just making a statement, he was attempting to redefine Emily's reality, to convince her that his version of her past was the only truth. At dinner parties with colleagues, Richard would consistently speak over Emily, cutting her off mid-sentence, or dismissing her contributions with a wave of his hand. When she, with a quiet courage, attempted to join the conversation, he would chuckle, a dismissive, patronizing sound that invited others to join in his mockery. At more formal gatherings, like parties, he'd scrutinize her elegant yet understated wardrobe and refer to it as quaint, a word designed to evoke laughter from women draped in glittering gowns and flashy jewelry. He was intentionally creating a public spectacle of her perceived inadequacy, feeding his own ego by tearing hers down. When Emily, in moments of quiet despair, tried to hold his gaze, hoping to find a flicker of the man she once loved, or at least a recognition of her pain, he would only smirk. Not a friendly, playful smirk, but a cruel, cold one that carved deeper wounds than any shouted words ever could. This isn't just about mean comments, it's about a systematic campaign to destroy a person's spirit. It's about leveraging social situations to amplify the humiliation, ensuring witnesses to the degradation. This kind of public shaming is a hallmark of deeply insecure individuals who project their own failings onto others. Richard needed an audience for his cruelty because his self-worth was entirely dependent on external validation and the perceived subjugation of his wife. And then there was his infidelity. Richard's affairs were no secret. He didn't even bother with the flimsy pretense of hiding perfume on his shirts or lipstick on his collar. He paraded other women in front of Emily, daring her to protest, challenging her to react, to give him a reason to justify his egregious behavior. Vanessa, a younger woman with sharp cheekbones and an insatiable appetite for the spotlight, became his favorite accessory. He took her to restaurants he once reserved for anniversaries with Emily, leaving a trail of photos scattered across social media, ensuring his wife would inevitably see them. It wasn't just about the affair, it was about the deliberate public flaunting of it, a calculated move to inflict maximum pain and public humiliation. One evening, after another night out with Vanessa, Richard returned home, loosening his tie, his face flushed with the satisfaction of his cruelty. He delivered the final, crushing blow, a statement designed to leave no room for doubt. "Face it, Emily. You're not enough for me. You never were." Emily's response was not what he expected. There were no tears, no shouts, no desperate pleas. Her answer was silence, a profound, unwavering silence. She refused to match his cruelty with anger, to give him the emotional reaction he so clearly craved. Instead, she folded laundry, prepared meals, and went about her days with the same calm grace she had carried since the first day of their marriage. This stoicism, this quiet fortitude, was her shield, her only defense against a storm she could not control. Richard, in his supreme arrogance, mistook her stillness for weakness. He never realized, not for a moment, how much immense strength it took to remain steady, to keep one's head held high in the eye of the emotional hurricane he himself had created. He saw her composure as a sign of her brokenness, failing to grasp that it was, in fact, a testament to her unbreakable spirit. This is a common miscalculation made by abusers. They interpret the victim's quiet resilience as a sign of defeat, rather than a deeper, more profound form of power. Emily wasn't weak. She was strategically conserving her energy, observing and preparing. By the time Richard filed for divorce, he treated it as though he were announcing a promotion, a triumph. He dropped the papers on the coffee table as casually as he might toss car keys, a gesture of ultimate disdain. "This is it, Emily," he declared, his voice dripping with condescension. "I'm freeing myself. You'll be gone from this house within weeks." He expected tears, pleas, bargaining, a desperate clinging to what he considered a worthless marriage. Instead, Emily, with that same unshakable calm, gathered the papers, set them aside neatly, and returned to her book without a single word. Her restraint unnerved him more than any shouting could have. It chipped away at his carefully constructed reality, where she was merely a puppet for his emotional manipulation. But he quickly shook it off with a dismissive laugh. "Pathetic," he muttered, convinced he had won, that her silence was merely a pitiful acceptance of her fate. In the weeks that followed, Richard truly acted like a man reborn, but it was a rebirth of hubris. He purchased a new, tailored suit for the hearing, polished his cufflinks until they gleamed, reflecting his inflated self-image. He rehearsed lines he imagined delivering to reporters, crafting a narrative about leaving behind a burden. At cocktail hours with his friends, he regaled them with jokes about how Emily would walk out of the courthouse with nothing but her pride, a brittle, empty thing in his estimation. The laughter that followed his words inflated his ego further, reinforcing his delusion of absolute victory. This is a classic example of confirmation bias, where individuals only seek out information and reactions that validate their existing beliefs, however flawed those beliefs may be. Richard was building an echo chamber of his own making, deaf to any dissenting perspective. Emily, on the other hand, prepared quietly. She pressed a simple white blouse, folded a small overnight bag, and tucked a sealed envelope into her purse. She didn't share her thoughts with anyone. Her expression, serene and unreadable, carried a glimmer of something even Richard, in his self-absorption, couldn't interpret. It was a premonition of change, a quiet resolve that hinted at a deeper game he was utterly unaware of. Her preparation was not about outward show, but about internal readiness, a stark contrast to Richard's superficial displays. She understood that true power doesn't need to be loud. It simply needs to be. The court date was marked for a Friday morning in April. Spring sunlight spilled across the city, warming the sidewalks, as if mocking the chill that had settled between them long ago. Richard woke early, his confidence humming through his veins like a triumphant melody. He looked in the mirror, straightened his tie, and whispered to himself, "Today I win." He saw only his own reflection, completely blind to the larger world, the unseen forces already in motion. That same morning, Emily sat at her vanity in silence. She brushed her hair, slipped into her blouse, and watched the light shift slowly across the room. She allowed herself the faintest smile, a smile Richard had not seen in years, a smile that held a secret, a promise, and a quiet strength. Neighbors saw him leave the driveway first, Vanessa at his side, her laughter echoing in the crisp morning air, a sound designed to irritate and belittle. They saw Emily leave much later, alone, her steps calm and deliberate, each one a testament to her unyielding resolve. They didn't know what rested behind her quiet demeanor, nor did Richard, who was already imagining his life after the courtroom, free of the woman he thought had shackled him. He strode into the courthouse like a man walking a red carpet, basking in the imagined glory of his freedom. Colleagues clapped him on the back, and he absorbed their approval like a parched sponge. "She won't get a dime," he told one man with a smug grin. "She's got nothing to claim." The whispers stirred around him, fueled by his own narrative. Poor wife walking away with empty hands, Richard Coleman beat the system. He absorbed every word, convinced it was true. Emily had not yet arrived, and the murmurs grew louder. "She's probably too embarrassed to show up," someone said, confirming Richard's biased expectations. He smirked. "Wouldn't surprise me," he replied, tugging at his polished cufflinks, a gesture of casual arrogance. Yet beneath his bravado, a small, almost imperceptible unease stirred. It was faint, easily drowned out by the noise of his self-importance, but it lingered, a tiny, persistent question mark in the back of his mind. Something in Emily's steady silence had planted it there, a question he refused to name, a doubt he refused to acknowledge. As the judge prepared to enter, Richard leaned back in his seat, satisfied. He could almost taste the freedom he craved, a freedom he believed he had earned through his ruthless ambition. For him, the marriage was nothing more than a tedious story nearing its final page. For Emily, however, the real story had not yet begun. This is where Richard's fundamental error lay. He believed the narrative was his, alone to control, that Emily was merely a supporting character in his triumphant saga. Emily's quiet had never been emptiness. It was watchfulness, a deliberate strategy. Behind every soft gaze and patient nod, there was a history Richard had never cared to uncover, a depth he had been too superficial to perceive. Long before she became Emily Coleman, she had been Emily Harrington, the daughter of Charles Harrington, one of the wealthiest industrial magnates on the eastern seaboard. Her childhood had been shaped not by want but by abundance, an abundance carefully hidden behind discreet gates and sprawling estates, far from the public eye. Yet her parents, Charles and Margaret, had raised her differently. They were not ostentatious with their wealth, but rather imbued with a profound sense of character. They taught her that money without character was a hollow shield, a fragile illusion. So when she met Richard years earlier, they had allowed her the freedom to choose him, to follow her heart. They said nothing when he failed to ask about her family in depth, nothing when he made assumptions about her modest lifestyle. To Emily's discerning parents, it was a test. Would Richard love her for who she truly was, for her intrinsic worth, not for the colossal fortune tied to her name? Would he see beyond the surface, or be blinded by his own ambition and preconceptions? For a while, Emily believed he did. His charm was intoxicating, his ambition contagious. The early days were filled with the intoxicating energy of new love, the promise of a shared future. But ambition, without the tempering influence of humility, has a way of rotting into greed, into a corrosive need for control and superiority. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, Richard revealed his disdain for the very qualities she cherished: her simplicity, her calm, her preference for meaning over spectacle. He saw these as weaknesses, as signs of her obscurity, rather than virtues. And still she had stayed, hoping love would soften him, hoping that the man she fell in love with would resurface from beneath the layers of his burgeoning ego. But Charles and Margaret Harrington had watched in silence long enough. They attended none of Richard's superficial dinners. They sent no gifts on anniversaries, allowing Richard to comfortably assume that Emily's background was nothing more than small-town roots. And Richard never pressed further. Why would he? He was content to believe in his superiority, to bask in the illusion that he had uplifted her from humble origins. He saw no need to investigate further because his narrative perfectly served his ego. When news of the divorce reached them, however, their silence ended. Charles Harrington sat in his oak-paneled study, staring out at the rolling acres of his estate, a man whose quiet power was absolute. His daughter's dignity had been mistaken for weakness, her kindness trampled under Richard's vulgar pride. That, he decided, was where the experiment ended. "Margaret," he said softly that evening, his voice resonating with a steel forged over decades of business acumen, "enough is enough." His wife nodded, her pearl necklace catching the light of the fire, her eyes mirroring his resolve. "She has carried herself with grace," Margaret affirmed, "but grace should not be mistaken for invisibility. It's time." Their conversation was short, understated, but it carried the weight of a monumental decision. It was the quiet pivot point, the moment when the unseen forces began to align. Within days, arrangements were meticulously made. Black SUVs were polished to a mirror sheen, chauffeurs briefed with precise instructions, and security men, dressed in tailored suits, stood ready. Their attorney, Jonathan Reed, a man whose reputation preceded him in Boston's legal circles, reviewed files that had never seen the light of day until now. Documents that outlined Emily's staggering inheritance, her intricate trust funds, her significant stakes in companies that dwarfed Richard's entire portfolio. This wasn't merely wealth, it was an empire. Emily did not protest when her parents laid out the plan. She only listened, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression serene but resolute. At last she spoke, with that same calm tone Richard had always misunderstood, a tone he had mistaken for submission. "I want no revenge," she stated, her voice steady and clear. "Only truth. Let him see who I really am." Margaret touched her hand, her eyes brimming with a quiet pride that only a mother could possess. "Then truth is what he shall have, darling." The simplicity of the exchange belied the monumental impact of their decision. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about reclaiming identity, about setting the record straight, not for the world, but for herself. It was about defining her worth on her own terms, independent of Richard's cruel narrative. The morning of the hearing, Charles Harrington made a rare phone call to his driver. 10 cars, he instructed. "No fewer. Let the city know where my daughter belongs." His voice was measured, not boastful, but utterly resolute. It was a declaration, a statement of fact that would soon reverberate through the courthouse. Emily prepared differently that day. She did not press a plain blouse. She chose a navy dress, cut simply but stitched with a quiet elegance that whispered of refined taste, not ostentatious display. She wore no glittering jewels, save for a thin, delicate bracelet her mother had given her on her 16th birthday, a subtle heirloom that carried more meaning than any diamond. Her hair fell naturally over her shoulders, unfussy, unadorned, She wanted no spectacle of wealth. She wanted only the clarity of identity, the unvarnished truth of who she was. Still, the convoy had been decided. When she stepped from her townhouse, escorted by two silent, formidable guards, she saw the line of cars waiting, sleek, black, and formidable, stretching down the street. For the first time in years, a flicker of nerves passed through her. She had hidden this part of herself for so long, endured so much in its shadow. Now, every secret, every carefully guarded truth was about to surface, to explode into the public eye. Her father approached, dapper in his dark suit, and kissed her cheek, a gesture of unwavering support. "You've endured long enough, Emily. Today, the world remembers your name." She smiled faintly, a genuine, if fleeting, smile. And Richard learns it for the first time. Meanwhile, Richard, seated smugly inside the courthouse, had no idea of the storm forming just blocks away. He leaned back in his chair, whispering to Vanessa about their vacation plans once the divorce was finalized, already mentally spending the money he expected to gain. Around him, whispers circulated, fed by his own boasts. The poor wife won't even show. She has nothing. She'll walk away invisible. It was a chorus of affirmation for his inflated ego. Jonathan Reed, the Harrington family's attorney, checked his watch as the convoy turned onto the courthouse street, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. Inside the lead SUV, Emily breathed deeply, a final moment of quiet before the inevitable. Her mother reached for her hand, her touch firm and reassuring. "Hold your head high, darling. Dignity first, always." And so the stage was set. Richard believed he was moments away from victory, gloating in the certainty that Emily's silence meant surrender. But silence was not surrender. Silence was preparation. The Harringtons were coming, and the world Richard thought he ruled. The reality he had so carefully constructed was about to collapse in a single, earth-shattering revelation. The courthouse in downtown Boston stood solemn beneath the morning sun, its grand stone columns casting long shadows across the steps. Inside, the air buzzed with low conversations, the kind of hum that gathers when people sense a spectacle is near, an event promising drama and intrigue. Richard Coleman strode into the chamber with the swagger of a man convinced the outcome was already his chest puffed out, his gaze sweeping the room for validation. Vanessa, perched confidently on his arm, wore a dress far too glamorous for a courtroom, its sequins shimmering, her sharp eyes scanning for recognition, for the validation she craved as Richard's favored accessory. Richard greeted colleagues and acquaintances as if he were at a networking event, rather than the somber end of his marriage. He shook hands, flashed his polished cufflinks, and grinned widely when men leaned in to congratulate him, their whispers laced with admiration for his perceived triumph. "You're a free man," one whispered, clapping his shoulder, a sentiment Richard relished. He only nodded, basking in the affirmation, believing every word. He was certain Emily would not arrive, or if she did, she would appear timid, unadorned, exactly as he liked to remember her, meek, humble, and utterly insignificant. Reporters lingered in the back rows, their pens and recorders ready. Divorce among the city's business elite always drew curiosity, always promised a juicy story, and Richard never minded attention. In fact, he had already rehearsed a short, diplomatic line for them. "Some marriages simply run their course. I wish her well." It was polished, smooth, and carefully rehearsed to cast him in the best possible light, to portray him as the magnanimous victor. Minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last, and still there was no sign of Emily. The whispers in the courtroom grew louder, morphing into a collective murmur of expectation and mild disappointment for those hoping for drama. A woman in a navy suit leaned toward her friend and murmured, "She probably won't show. What's the point? He stripped her of everything." Another voice added, "He'll walk out richer than he walked in, probably taking her last dime." Richard overheard and smiled faintly, crossing one leg over the other, as though enjoying a private, well-orchestrated performance. The bailiff moved through the room, instructing everyone to prepare for the judge's entrance. The heavy wooden doors at the front creaked open briefly, but only a clerk entered, carrying a stack of files. Richard's attorney leaned close and whispered, "Once she's marked absent, this will be straightforward. We'll finalize everything in minutes." Richard nodded, his smirk widening. In his mind, he was already planning dinner reservations for later that evening, imagining Vanessa laughing at his jokes, imagining the toasts his friends would raise to his hard-won freedom. His narrative was unfolding perfectly, just as he had scripted it. But then came a pause, an unusual pause. The clerk at the side door glanced toward the main entrance, frowning slightly as if something unexpected, something unusual, were unfolding in the hallway outside. Low murmurs drifted in from outside, muffled at first, but rising like a tide. The sound of many footsteps echoed, heavy and synchronized, not the hurried scurry of a single late arrival, but the deliberate march of a disciplined group. Richard shifted uneasily in his seat, a prickle of irritation at the edge of his voice. "What's going on out there?" he asked, his composure momentarily faltering. Vanessa squeezed his arm, feigning curiosity. "Maybe another high-profile case," she whispered, but her eyes darted toward the double doors with a hint of nervousness, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. The murmurs inside the courtroom grew restless, more insistent. People craned their necks, whispering guesses. "Sounds like security. Maybe a senator. Who comes to family court with that kind of entourage?" The judge had not yet entered, and so the attention of the entire room funneled toward those heavy wooden doors, a magnet for their collective curiosity. Even Richard leaned forward now, his cufflinks catching the light, a flicker of doubt crossing his carefully composed expression. The bailiff returned from the hallway, his posture straighter, more rigid than before. He whispered something to the clerk, who blinked and then quickly, almost frantically, adjusted papers on the desk. There was an unmistakable shift in the air, a palpable change, as though the very walls sensed that the routine divorce case of Richard Coleman had just been rewritten, its predictable ending about to be violently overturned. Richard forced a laugh, a hollow sound trying to mask his sudden unease. "Probably just a city official," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction, a tremor betraying his inner turmoil. He smoothed his tie, a nervous habit, and leaned back again, as if daring whatever came through those doors to challenge his supremacy, his carefully cultivated authority. Vanessa, however, fidgeted, her polished nails tapping against the bench. She had grown accustomed to attention, reveling in the spotlight Richard afforded her. But this was different. The energy outside was too deliberate, too commanding, too much like a predetermined event. It didn't feel like coincidence. It felt like an announcement. The crowd's whispers built into a steady hum, a crescendo of anticipation, until at last the handles of the great wooden doors turned. Conversations halted. Even the sound of shuffling papers ceased. The air seemed to hold its breath, pregnant with unspoken expectation. Richard straightened in his seat, preparing to dismiss whoever appeared as irrelevant, a mere distraction from his moment of triumph. He could not imagine, even in his wildest thoughts, that the person about to step through those doors was his wife, the same woman he had mocked, neglected, and dismissed as poor, as a nobody. For now, he only waited, impatient, irritated, but still arrogantly certain that the story unfolding belonged solely to him, that he was the undisputed protagonist. The courtroom was ready. The stage was set. All that remained was the entrance that would shatter Richard's illusions forever, scattering the fragments of his carefully constructed reality. The courtroom door swung open with deliberate force, the hinges releasing a low groan that silenced every breath in the room. A single bailiff stepped inside, his voice carrying over the benches, firm and commanding. "All rise." It was not for the judge, as everyone first assumed, but for the entourage that entered behind him, an unprecedented display in a family court. The first sight was a line of black SUVs, perfectly aligned outside the courthouse windows, their tinted glass glinting beneath the late morning sun. Uniformed drivers stood at rigid attention near the vehicles, earpieces coiled tightly, their posture unmistakably professional, reminiscent of a dignitary's arrival. This was no accident, no ordinary arrival. It was a meticulously planned statement. Into the room swept men in dark suits, broad-shouldered bodyguards whose movements were crisp, synchronized, whose gazes scanned the room with the precision of military detail, assessing every corner, every face. Behind them, walking with an elegance that hushed every murmur, that drew every eye, came Emily Coleman. No, not Emily Coleman, Emily Harrington. Her maiden name, the name of true power, finally reclaiming its rightful place. Her tailored ivory suit glowed under the courtroom lights, a beacon of understated luxury, of undeniable class. A delicate pearl necklace rested against her collarbone, understated yet commanding, an heirloom embodying generations of quiet strength. Every step she took landed softly, deliberately, but resonated like thunder in Richard's ears, each one a hammer blow to his carefully constructed world. Behind her followed Charles Harrington, a man whose mere name in Boston's business corridors could stall negotiations, shift markets, and command respect. His presence was formidable, his gaze unwavering, and beside him, Margaret Harrington, regal, composed, her gloved hand lightly resting on her husband's arm, her eyes holding a lifetime of wisdom and quiet power. Their combined presence transformed the modest chamber into something resembling a state hall, an arena of titans. Richard's jaw slackened. The color drained from his face as he half rose, half stumbled, gripping the bench for support, his carefully cultivated composure shattering into 1,000 pieces. He had mocked her for years, treated her as invisible, a person without consequence or standing. And now here she was, walking toward him, not as the poor, pitiable Emily, but as if she had never once lived under his shadow, but rather above it, in a world he could never touch, could never even comprehend. Gasps fluttered through the courtroom like a sudden collective wave. Reporters scrambled with pens, desperate to record the sight, to capture the seismic shift in the room's energy. One whispered urgently to another, his voice barely audible. "That's Charles Harrington, Harrington Industries. He's worth billions." Another voice hissed, "She's his daughter, Richard's wife." The scandal was electric, too astonishing to process in a single moment, a bombshell exploding in slow motion. Emily did not glance at Richard immediately. Her gaze swept the room with quiet dignity, acknowledging the judge, the attorneys, even the startled clerks. Her eyes held no malice, no triumph, only a profound distance, as though she were observing a man who had long ago lost the privilege of mattering to her, a relic of a past she was about to shed. Richard's lips trembled, his face a mask of dawning horror. "Emily," he stammered, his voice catching in his throat, hoarse with disbelief. "What is this? What's going on?" She did not reply. Instead, Jonathan Reed, the Harrington family's attorney, stepped forward with a calm authority that rivaled even the judge's bench. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, his voice resonating with quiet power, "Mrs. Coleman, my client, is present, accompanied by her family. We will be contesting the terms of this divorce." The judge, momentarily caught off guard, nodded with an unusual respect, sensing the gravity of the situation. "Very well, proceed." Richard flailed for composure, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. His attorney leaned close, whispering frantically, his face pale. "Why didn't you tell me she was Harrington's daughter?" Richard's silence was answer enough. He hadn't known. He had been blind, too self-assured, too arrogant, too consumed by his own petty triumphs to ever wonder who Emily truly was, to ever scratch beneath the surface of his own dismissive narrative. Vanessa shrank in her seat, her earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. She clutched her handbag as if it could shield her from the sudden, overwhelming shift of power in the room. No one looked at her anymore. She was invisible beside Emily's quiet radiance, a mere footnote to a story that was now exploding into headlines, a story she was now merely a spectator to. Emily's voice finally rose, steady and resonant, cutting through the stunned silence. "For years you told me I was nothing," she said, her words directed at Richard, yet carried to every corner of the room, a public indictment. "You told me I was worthless, unlovable, disposable, and now the truth stands before you." Richard shook his head violently, his arrogance collapsing into desperation, tears beginning to well in his eyes. "Emily, please listen. I didn't mean—" But she lifted her hand, silencing him with a grace sharper than any shout, a gesture of absolute, unyielding control. "No," she said simply. The word was final, definitive, echoing longer than any plea, heavier than any accusation. The room was utterly still, the weight of revelation pressing against every witness, against every soul present. Richard, once the proud orchestrator of this divorce, was now the defeated man at its center, stripped bare, his humiliation complete. He had mocked a woman who was far beyond his reach, beyond his understanding, beyond his petty world. He had gambled his dignity, his future on a false narrative, and the bet was spectacularly lost. Outside, the convoy of black SUVs waited patiently, engines purring like watchful beasts, ready to carry Emily away into a new, empowered future. Inside, the trial had shifted irrevocably. Emily was no longer the poor, humiliated wife. She was the daughter of power, the woman cloaked in dignity, the heiress who no longer needed to explain herself, no longer needed to justify her existence to anyone, least of all, him. Richard's knees weakened. He lowered himself into his seat, his eyes darting between the judge, the unmoving guards, and Emily's impenetrable calm, searching for any sign of mercy, any crack in her resolve. For the first time, his voice carried no arrogance, no hint of his former self. It was soft, broken, nearly childlike in its desperation. "Emily, I didn't know." She met his gaze briefly, a fleeting, almost clinical glance, then looked away, as if he were already gone from her world. "Exactly," she replied, the single word carrying the weight of years of silent suffering, of years of being unseen. The courtroom understood. The world outside would soon understand. Richard Coleman's empire of pride had crumbled, and it had taken only the quiet truth of the woman he once dismissed to destroy it. Richard lurched forward in his seat, panic radiating from every pore, a cold sweat breaking out on his brow. His once proud shoulders slumped. His tailored suit now seemed ill-fitting. His tie sat askew, and his mouth quivered with words he struggled to form, words that were now meaningless. He had built a reputation on control. Deals won, rooms dominated, egos crushed beneath his iron heel. But here, in this courtroom, control had utterly abandoned him. He rose to his feet suddenly, startling even his own lawyer, who looked on with a mixture of pity and professional despair. "Emily," he said, his voice cracking, thick with a desperation he had never known. "Please don't do this." His hands extended as if reaching across an invisible divide that had widened into an unbridgeable canyon. Emily remained seated, calm, composed, her family forming a protective, impenetrable barrier at her side. Her father, Charles Harrington, leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing with a quiet fury, the slow-burning anger of a man who had watched his daughter suffer in silence for too long. Margaret rested a hand on her husband's arm, her expression unreadable, but firm, an echo of her earlier resolve. Jonathan Reed, the attorney, cleared his throat, his voice cutting through Richard's desperate pleas. "Your Honor, Mr. Coleman's pleas are irrelevant to the proceedings. The motion for divorce stands. We are ready to proceed." But Richard could not stop himself. Pride no longer anchored him. It had dissolved, leaving him adrift in a sea of raw regret. Desperation dragged him forward. He dropped to his knees right there in front of the bench, a man completely undone. His palms pressed together, as though a desperate prayer could somehow rewrite history, could undo years of callous cruelty. "Emily, I was wrong," he whispered, then louder, his voice raw and broken. "I was blind, arrogant, cruel. But I love you. I swear I can change. Give me one more chance." The courtroom buzzed, a cacophony of whispers and gasps. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens scratching across notepads. Cameras clicked, eager to capture the spectacle of a man completely undone, his arrogance melted into raw, pleading regret. Vanessa shrank further in her seat, her face pale, wishing the floor would open and consume her. She had come ready to flaunt victory, to bask in the reflected glory of Richard's triumph. But instead, she sat as an afterthought to a story that had spectacularly rewritten itself, a mere extra in a drama she couldn't comprehend. Emily finally stood. The soft rustle of her suit carried more weight than Richard's collapsing pleas, more authority than any shouted command. She looked at him, not with hatred, not even with pity, but with absolute clarity, a profound understanding of the irreparable damage he had caused. "You didn't just betray me," she said, her voice steady, resonant, slicing through the courtroom's charged air. "You humiliated me. You mocked me. You told me I was nothing, and you did it all because you thought I had no worth." Her words sank into Richard like ice, chilling him to the bone, forcing him to confront the full, horrifying truth of his actions. He shook his head furiously, tears beginning to pool, streaming down his face. "I was wrong, Emily. Please, you're everything. I see it now. I'll spend the rest of my life proving it." But she shook her head gently, definitively. "It's too late, Richard." The silence that followed was heavier than any shout, more crushing than any accusation. Even the judge seemed reluctant to interrupt, giving space for the profound, irreversible moment to breathe. Richard stayed on his knees, his hands trembling, his face wet with regret, a broken man. Yet Emily's stance was resolute, unwavering. Jonathan Reed addressed the judge once more, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "Your Honor, the Harrington family supports the dissolution of this marriage. My client seeks no reconciliation, she only seeks closure." The judge nodded, his gavel coming down with solemn weight. "Divorce granted." The sound echoed like the final nail sealing a coffin, marking the official end of a life, a dream, an illusion. Richard flinched as though physically struck, his body folding inward under the blow, completely defeated. Emily, however, straightened, her shoulders lifted, her gaze fixed forward, toward a future unburdened by his cruelty. She walked with her family, each step measured, each movement declaring her freedom, her reclaimed dignity. As she passed Richard, still kneeling, a pathetic figure lost in his despair, she paused just long enough for her words to reach him clearly, piercing the silence. "You wanted me gone because you thought I was beneath you. Now you've lost me, and you'll never rise high enough to reach me again." She turned, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor, the sound a punctuation mark to her final statement. Bodyguards opened the doors with practiced efficiency. The Harringtons moved as one unit, their presence unshakable, a force of quiet power. The convoy outside awaited, engines purring, doors open like a promise of dignity reclaimed, of a future forged on her own terms. Reporters surged to the windows, snapping frantic photographs as Emily stepped into the sunlight, her figure framed by the imposing black vehicles. The once poor wife, long ridiculed and dismissed, now walked with the aura of a queen, her head held high, her family surrounding her, an undeniable testament to her true identity and power. The court had ended, but her story, her true story, had only just begun. Richard stumbled after her, restrained gently by a bailiff at the door, his voice hoarse, broken. "Emily!" he cried desperately. "Please, I'll do anything." But she did not turn back. The doors closed behind her, shutting him out of a world he had never truly deserved, a world he had been too blind to see. Outside, the black SUVs rolled forward, carrying her away from the wreckage of a marriage built on arrogance and deception, toward a future of self-worth and genuine respect. Inside, Richard sank onto a bench, the whispers of the crowd clawing at him, their judgments a tormenting chorus. The truth settled like a weight too heavy to bear, crushing him. He had destroyed the only treasure that ever mattered, the genuine connection, the intrinsic worth of the woman he married, and no plea, no regret, could undo it. He had played with her dignity, and now dignity itself had written his downfall, a resounding testament to the unseen strength of quiet resilience. Richard's downfall reminds us that arrogance blinds and cruelty destroys. It's a stark lesson in perception versus reality, in the profound danger of underestimating another human being. Never underestimate quiet dignity, for it carries unseen strength, a resilience forged in silence that can withstand the harshest storms. True love should honor, not belittle. It should elevate, not diminish. Respect the one beside you, for true worth is rarely measured in money or appearances, but in character, loyalty, and kindness. And so Emily walked away, not just divorced, but victorious, whole and free. She proved that silence is not weakness, and that dignity, in the end, always wins. Now let me ask you, what do you think? If you were Emily, after enduring years of such systematic humiliation and abuse, would you forgive Richard's desperate pleas in that courtroom? Or would you, like Emily, walk away, knowing that some lines, once crossed, can never be uncrossed?